My name is Wim van Saar. I'm the president of ESAC. I'll tell you a bit more about ESAC in a minute. But first I would like to share with you the program. We'll first have a keynote talk by Helena Nader, the president of the Brazilian Academy of Sciences, and I'll tell you why we invited Helena in a minute. Then Helena and I will take a few minutes to talk about what science academies can do for global challenges to give their science for policy advice. And then we have 3 talks by Rosa Castro on the climate change and health, by Thomas Elmquist on food production and food security, and Sol Molnar, who will be talking about biodiversity issues. And then we'll have a panel discussion that will also be joined by Jason Jabbour, who's here on the panel in front. Now, as I said, just a word about ESAC, the organization which is organizing this session. It's the Organization of Science Academies in Europe that is aiming to give independent science for policy advice, in particular on environment, energy, and biosciences and public health. These are issues that transcend what an individual nation can do, and they're actually often global issues, of course. And ESAC is the organization of academies that join hands, that work together to give science advice aimed in particular at the policies of Brussels, or giving advice to the countries in Europe, and in particular to what the European Commission is intending to do on these issues. We're also, and I'll explain that a little bit later, you see that if you can, well, some of you can see it, IAP was also organizing a session on global or climate change and health yesterday, with a regional network also of IAP, which is the global network. But again, we'll come back to that. So, without further ado, let me introduce Helena Nader. And Helena will speak on the recommendations of the S20. Now, not all of you may know what the S20 are. You do know, I'm sure, what the G20 is, the collection of the largest countries in the world that come together regularly, and this year Brazil is chairing the G20. Now, about 10 years ago or so, the countries or the academies from the G20 countries decided to also form the S20, the Science 20 countries. And very much like the G20 is being presided every year by a different country, likewise the presidency of the S20 is following the presidency of the G20. And so this year, as you know, the G20 is being chaired by Brazil. This year, the Brazilian Academy was chaired by the Brazilian Academy of Sciences. And Helena Nader played an extremely important role in bringing the science academies from the S20 together. I had the privilege of being invited by her to the meeting in Rio in July, where they drew up the final communiqué and advice from the S20. And it was with a combination of extreme wisdom and perseverance, and I would say friendliness and charm as well, that Helena was able to bring these countries, the academies from these countries together, and have a number of very important recommendations. And I'm not going to give away, but I know that your work has been very successful, but I'll let you tell about that. So Helena, we're very happy that you've accepted our invitation. Helena Nader is a professor emeritus from the University of Sao Paulo, and her field is biomedical sciences. Helena, the floor is yours.
Good morning to all of you. It's an honor to be here. It's an honor to be presented by you, women. I want to thank ESAC for this kind invitation and everyone from the World Science Forum, because it's a panel that's becoming very important for the globe. I'm going to bring some informations on the communique. That's the final document. And I just want to make sure that everybody remembers who are the G20 members. Argentina, Australia, Brazil, Canada, China, France, Germany, India, Indonesia, Italy, Japan, Mexico, Russia, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, South Korea, Turkey, United Kingdom, United States, and this year it starts with African Union, and we have the European Union. And what Brazil decided, Brazilian Academy of Science decided to do that was different from the other meetings of the S20. We decided to invite different other partners that discuss science in order to get people together into the same pace. So we invited ESAC, we invited IAP, we invited ISC, International Science, all academies that were not directly into the group of G20, but partially, because the G20 has the 5 continents. So, and the G20 represent around, it varies a lot, but around 80%, 85% of the global economy. But I want to point out also something that's very relevant. G20 members do not have the same, not only economical conditions, because that changes, but what's much harder to change is demography. Demographic conditions are totally different among the G20 countries. We cannot forget that, and that is true whenever we discuss science. Science for whom? Why? How can we implement that? For instance, Europe has a much older population in comparison with India. That's the majority is young generation or Indonesian and so on. I want to make this point clear. And Brazil, how did we manage to get people into this drive into science? We are very concerned in Brazil, the Brazilian Academy of Science, as well as IANAS, as well as ESAC. That's why we're having this meeting here with the 23rd agenda. And unfortunately, our government sometimes do not remember documents that they signed. And I always want to start with this. In September 2015, at the United Nations General Assembly, 193 heads of state and government and high representatives committed to the 23rd Agenda for Sustainable Development. They designed, after several discussions, there were too many, it was shrinking, and finally we got to 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And what we cannot forget, it's clearly written, the ethical principle of equity. Leave no one behind. That's the most important statement, in my opinion, of the 23rd Agenda. And unfortunately, we are far, far away from that. So here are the SDGs, everybody. I'm not going to talk about all of them. And I truly believe that all SDGs face challenge with climate change. And that's another issue that we need to approach. We should have approached already, but we need to move forward because people are still questioning climate change. I don't know how many of the ones that questioned took attention to the water that poured in Valencia, in Spain, a few weeks ago, all of a sudden, and more than 200 people, old people died, and died because they couldn't move, and that's something that happens. In Brazil, there is a river that's now a road because it's totally dried. And a few months before, we had rain all over Rio Grande do Sul, the state in the south, that destroyed more than 25 cities. So climate change is a reality. And I like a lot this paper that was made by Sachs, who is a fighter for climate change, for sustainable development goals, and has as a co-author a very nice, important economist, Mariana Mazzucato. Mariana Mazzucato, everybody knows, she is Italian, but now she is several years ago, she moved to UK, and they took I have the references in there, and they decided to approach the 17 SDGs, getting them together, always with the focus of leave no one behind. So they got transformation 1 with education, gender and equality, transformation 2, health, well-being and demography, transformation 3, energy decarbonization, sustainable industry, 4, sustainable food, land, water and oceans, 5, sustainable cities and communities, and 6, digital revolution for sustainable development. They grouped some of the SDGs. And in this panel, we're going to have important inputs in some of these transformations. So, Brazil, as the host for the Science 2024, Science 2024. It sounds like a song. But we decided that, with bearing this in mind, we should have as a motto, science for global transformation. And there are too many topics. So we decide to have artificial intelligence with a discussion ethics, social impact, regulation and knowledge sharing, bioeconomy, shaping the world toward a sustainable planet, energy transition process, renewable energy, social and economic impacts, health challenge, quality actor, and so on, and social justice. But if you pay attention with the results that I'm going to show you very briefly, and we have some copies in here of the communiqué, social justice percolates all of that. Without social justice, we just wrote down social justice as a specific topic, but indeed, without bearing in mind social justice, you will not have what you want for the outcome of artificial intelligence, bioeconomy, energy transition, or health. Because all those can give more social injustice. And we're going to move just in the opposite direction. So, what we did very briefly, we set up several groups in our academy, wrote some thoughts for each task force, and sent to all academies in December, I think. and ask them to discuss internally what do they think about that, and come to Rio for the first meeting so that we could have a good discussion on the topic and go back home and then set up what would be a good text to finally in July write the communique. That took several months back and forth, sharing papers, and finally at the meeting in Rio, we indeed had a communique that was written by all academies. And at the end, since some presidents, we had many presidents present, but some were not able to be there. So we gave them 15 or 3 more weeks to go over the document, and minor corrections could be made. And I'll show at the end how many signed it. So, artificial intelligence, I highlight some things that I want to share with you. Job security and work's right. We need to think about that. Regulations and data governance. Without having a global way of looking, we are not going to move forward. The discrepancies among countries and within countries is going to increase. We cannot forget that. Invest in data infrastructure, because we are not going to compete with Google, ChatGPT, or others. But we need to have investment by the governments in some facilities that could be shared. So all of that is written in the manuscripts that we brought some in here, or you can find in the website that's still on the S20. We need to have, as I pointed out, regional academy research centers. We need to pay attention to oversee the AI technologies that may exceed human control. I don't know how to do it, but we need to start thinking, because that's not something from a science fiction book. That's reality nowadays. And we need to advocate the use of AI could be a great help in achieving the SDGs. Bioeconomy, we're going to have a discussion, so I'm going to go very briefly into that. What do we mean, the S20 members understand by bioeconomy? On supply of goods derived from renewable biological resources. That includes bio-based products, food, feed, bioenergy, health supplies, pharmaceuticals, and so on. And they have to be in line with the SDGs. So what did we recommend briefly? Invest in research and infrastructure, integrate social justice, integrate with the communities that are around the place where you are going to have this bioeconomy process going on, and robust international and multilateral cooperation. The G20 countries should have a consensus on the role of bioeconomy. And I'm glad to say that regarding bioeconomy, even before the meeting in Rio, the G20 issued a statement on bioeconomy that goes much into the same direction. Energy transition process. Clean energy sources such as solar, wind, hydropower, geothermal, and we should also invest a lot in mitigation and negative emissions. We need to move forward to phase out coal. We didn't even say fossil fuel. From coal, I'm not saying gas. Okay, let's make it clear. This is very important. Governments are not paying attention. But governments are not gods, and they don't survive forever. So, humanity needs to pay attention to this. Biofuels, remember, so many discussions. Wind was a good partner, really fantastic. Exactly, was fantastic. Really, thank you so much. We should consider ocean energy sources, including tidal wave and thermal. Batteries should rely. Also, we need to know how to get rid of the batteries, because that's a waste. There is no zero outcome for environment. We are always going, unfortunately, to have a certain impact, but we can diminish the impact. We need to mitigate climate change, and this is very important. Public outreach education, enhancing awareness on the principle to reduce, to reuse, to recycle. We need to do that. The young generation knows that. They are being taught in schools, but parents don't practice what the kids are learning. So we have an obligation as society to change this behavior. And again, environmental justice. Because if we don't think of everybody, the ones that are going to suffer the most with climate change are going to be the poor ones. It's not going, because I don't know if it will be in Mars already, but it will not help to go to Mars. It's my opinion. Because we still don't have the conditions to be there. So we need to take care of this planet. It's the only one up to now, even though there are some people that believe that extra life comes around once in a while. But up to now, what we know is this planet, and we need to take care. Yeah, I'm going to finish. Health challenge, I talked already, and social justice. And here is the final document. It was signed by 19 of the 20. Unfortunately, just one country didn't sign for a minor word. We even tried to put an asterisk saying the word that they want, but it didn't work out. And the good news that I have to share with you is that the G20 countries met together in Rio on the 19th and 20th of this month, November, Monday and Tuesday, I think. And the document that was issued endorses most of the propositions made by science. I don't know if they are going to do it, but at least it's written. It's a victory. And here I want to thank Yazan for this invitation, and my academy, and my alma mater, Escola Paulista de Medicina, Federal University of São Paulo. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Helena. I think it's a tribute to you that the G20 has essentially followed many of your recommendations, and that shows that hard work really helps. Now, the idea was originally that we would take 5 minutes to tell a little bit about the various ways in which academies could contribute indeed to policy advice on the global level. But Helena has already done such a marvelous job in explaining what the S20 did. So I'll keep it short. We just wanted to give the message that, of course, many academies that have existed for a longer time are used to giving science for policy advice to their own national government. But with these global challenges, like the ones that Helena has just discussed, we need to team up either at the continental level or possibly at the global level, and Helena just discussed that. And so in between is what we also wanted to show, is that we also team up at the regional level. In this case, if you think about ESAC, which is shown here, that's the organization here in Europe of the science academies, as I explained in the beginning. We work together to science for policy advice on energy, environment, climate, and public health. But we're also, and that you see on the right there, we're the regional network of IAP, Inter-Academy Partnership, and likewise, the IAP has regional networks in the Americas, in Asia, and in Africa. And we increasingly feel and are very driven, and I think the fact that Helena invited the regional networks to the meeting in Rio illustrates that we're really committed to work together also again, we come from different backgrounds. The academies in Europe are typically older and are more experienced in giving science advice. In Africa, for instance, it's much more focused on capacity building, but still we really are convinced that working together at that level is important. I would say let's leave it at that, and let's not engage in a discussion here, but move right on to the 3 presentations that we'll have, and then we'll have a few more minutes for the panel discussion. So let me invite Rosa Castro to the floor to speak on scientific advice to address climate change impact on health. Rosa holds a PhD in law and economics from the universities of Rotterdam and Bologna. And since then, she has been increasingly involved in science for policy advice on health. And we're very happy that since about a year or so, we were able to convince her to join ESAC. She's now the program manager for our biosciences and public health panel. Rosa, the floor is yours. Whatever you prefer. I think it's easy.
Thanks so much, Wim, and good morning, everyone. I'm very honored to be here in this amazing panel. It's going to be difficult to follow Wim and Professor Nader, but I'll do my best. I wanted to say a few words, I think, today, and then leave the floor also for the other, my fellow panelists, and to engage in questions. But I wanted to bring the example of the work that ESAC did on climate change and health, because of, I think, basically 2 big reasons. One is that this picture that you see here was a report from 2019 that was published in 2019 on climate change and human health. And I think that the title, hopefully you see it, speaks for itself. It says the imperative of climate action to protect health in Europe. Actually, I must say it did a bit more, because it also looked at the effects globally and also locally. So that's a big reason. I think it was very pioneering. It might not be the first time that scientists were raising awareness about this, but it was a report that tried to reach out to the policymakers at EU level and try to push them on what the EU can do and why it should do it. And I think the second reason is because the report paid a lot of attention to the complexity of the factors that are at play at the interface of climate change and health. And I want to come back to one of the messages that Professor Nader just mentioned, which is the leave no one behind. So the report played a lot of emphasis on the fact that not only there's going to be, and there are already, tangible impacts on health of people, but also those impacts are not equally distributed, are really affecting much more vulnerable groups. I'll say a little bit more. And actually, maybe I will say now, the inequalities are very complex. So we hear a lot during the COP, especially discussions about the inequalities between low and middle income countries and high income countries, and of course, who are the major contributors to emissions and who are the ones paying the price in terms of also deaths and illnesses and socioeconomic losses. So that's a big inequality between regions and countries across the world. But there are also many other different inequalities at other levels. So there are inequalities in Europe, and the report actually focused on the European region, and I'll tell you a little bit more. There are different regions in Europe affected by climate change in different ways. And that's important for the scientific community to understand, to address. And then there are inequalities within the countries and also at regional level. But furthermore, there are also vulnerable groups that suffer the most. So there are minorities, and there are maybe the elderly, the children for different effects, pregnant women, and so on. So I think those are maybe, if you remember, just two messages are why this report was really so important. Those would be, okay. So just at another level, the report looked at the complexity of the impacts of climate change in health. And here is just maybe a snapshot of these impacts, which are actually, one of the messages of the report is there is enough evidence, scientific evidence to act. But of course, there are knowledge gaps. And the impacts of in health depend on different factors. So there's the hazard, but there's also the exposure to the different climate change effects. And there's also the vulnerability of the different people and populations. So many different impacts on food, on water, on health, so specific illnesses like cardiovascular diseases, respiratory diseases, the interfaces between climate change and air pollution, for instance. But also very importantly, the report already referred to mental health, which is something, a big issue in public health that I think it's receiving finally more attention, especially after COVID, but remember that this report came before COVID, so it was really important that it raised that point. So just to give a very, very quick example, for instance, this report built upon previous work by ISAC actually looking at the effects of climate change in infectious diseases in Europe. So this is just one of the indirect impacts, because it's actually about the presence of different vectors. So we have mosquitoes in different parts of Europe, and obviously because of climate change, there's these so-called climate-sensitive vectors that are now finding a more hospitable place in many places across Europe. So the beginning, you can see the different colors refer to the outbreaks of West Nile virus in Europe in different points of time. So the potential for these vectors to be present in Europe is growing because of climate change. The report of ISAC actually came back from 2010. So there was a report of scientists working at ISAC telling these things in 2010, and then the report in 2019 took this over and say, okay, we have to look also at these potential threats and how to address them. I think there is an example also of big inequalities in these areas, because, for example, mosquito-borne diseases such as dengue, but also Zika and chikungunya are differently, they are affecting predominantly people living in low and middle income countries. So this is a new thing for Europe, it's a new threat, so to say. But because traditionally these diseases have been impacting more people living in countries that don't have big ability to pay, there has been very little interest in developing new vaccines or in developing new medicines for these diseases. So they are called neglected diseases for a reason. So the fact of raising awareness about these It's very important because it also posed the question of Europe. Should Europe also invest more in these areas, in research and development? And maybe the reason is because these diseases are coming to Europe, but hopefully there is also an element of social justice on addressing the big burden of diseases worldwide. So I think I went on this actually at the beginning, but I want to just mention that the report of ISAC looked at the different inequalities in the different events that can cause disruption. And you already have mentioned, I think, and you have heard today about the events in Valencia, about the floods, and about heat waves. But in each of these events, or also the diseases transmitted by vectors, there are different groups. For instance, people living with chronic diseases will eventually be affected in a different way. And there needs to be more support and more research, and the scientific community needs to pay attention that this research in the future contributes to addressing the inequalities rather than especially the policies don't contribute to widen those existing inequalities. So I think just a word before finishing. So remember, the report came before COVID, and I think after COVID it was very evident that there was a pandemic also of socio-economic inequalities. And when COVID struck, I think for the public health community, outside of the research community that was very aware, it was clear that all these socio-economic determinants played a big role in the way people were affected by COVID ultimately, in terms of mortality, morbidity, and also other effects, including on mental health. And that's also the case for climate change. Now, what the report did also was to identify, obviously, the data gaps that were existing at that moment and to push for more action at EU level. So it is clear, I think, that this is a big example of a One Health issue. So it's not about only human health effects, but it's actually the combination of the elements of human health, but animal health, and especially the environment playing together. And well, the report obviously, one of the things that I have been highlighting is that it says that there was insufficient data on these different impacts and how their effects in the different areas across Europe, but also in populations that have higher risk. And of course, in areas, countries, or regions that have health systems that are less prepared to cope with these events. So that's another big message that came. So the ISAC working group that produced this report really wanted to ensure that many policies at EU level address these issues. And just like final message, these are not only policies in the health, let's say, health realm. Many of these actually transcend health. So there's this element of health in all policies, calling for all policies, also urbanization, for instance, to take into account these things when they plan the cities, take into account the fact that vulnerable groups might be faced to different impacts of climate health. So I think the very difficult part for the health sector is that many of these decisions on mitigation and adaptation do not depend on the health sector. But the health sector needs to reach out also to other sectors and work together with these other sectors to address these issues. And, well, I think the role of academies and scientific bodies is very clear, and Wim already went into this, so just to say maybe a last word is, and I know that my fellow panelists will talk more about this, but it's very important for the scientific sector to engage with other sectors and to engage as early as possible. So not only when the report or the final review of evidence are published at the last part of the work, but really since the beginning to address the real questions that communities and that the people affected by these impacts are living. So thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Rosa. We'll continue with the presentation by Thomas Elmquist, who since early this year is the program director of the environment program of ISAC. and he will speak on food production and food security in a changing climate. Thomas is a professor in natural resource management at the Stockholm Resilience Center of Stockholm University, and he has over 20 years of experience in working with international programs dealing with biodiversity and ecosystems, including for the United Nations and UNESCO. Thomas, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Wim, and good morning, everyone. So this session was about the science policy framework and how that could assist the implementation of the SDGs. So I'm going to focus in my presentation on one of these SDGs, SDG 2, on achieving zero hunger. And I think this SDG is in real jeopardy, and there are many reasons behind it, but one is climate change. That is really going to be a big challenge, given what we now know about the accelerating change we are experiencing around the globe. And looking at projections for the future when it comes to agricultural productivity, it's not a very upbeat picture. We have large areas of the world, Latin America, Central America, and even southern US, which will, in some areas, experience up to 50% reduction in agricultural productivity until 2080. So this is a long-term projection. And then, as you see, most of Africa will experience a reduction in agricultural productivity. South Asia, Western Australia, while you have other areas in the Northern Hemisphere that actually will perhaps see an increase in productivity. And the reason for that is that climate change has multiple effects. One effect, actually, of increasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is that you have a fertilization effect, that you boost the photosynthesis. And so in some areas, you will actually increase productivity just because of an increase in carbon dioxide. But also in areas in the Northern Hemisphere, particularly where you will have a shorter or longer season, you could perhaps go 1 or 2 crops or even 3 crops where you currently only could grow 1. And you will have perhaps more precipitation in areas which now are experiencing temporary droughts. So that are effects that could happen perhaps more in the Northern Hemisphere. In the Southern Hemisphere, we are more likely to see more severe droughts, heat stress, pests, and actually a slow growing during the vegetation period. And you could also have, as we've seen in Brazil, for example, flooding events coming, destroying crops over large areas. So there's this mixed picture of what climate change will mean. So if we look globally in the future, what are the prospects for production of major crops? And here is one analysis. And if we look at the temperature interval between 2 and 3, which is where we are heading, unfortunately, we can see for maize, rice, wheat, and soy that there is maybe a 20% reduction globally of agricultural productivity. For some reason, rice seems to be a little bit more resistant, even with increasing temperature, which is interesting, that rice might have that capacity. But agriculture is not only affected by climate change, agriculture is also contributing to climate change, and we need to keep that in mind, that agriculture and agricultural sector, including forestry, is just as responsible as the energy production or transportation or industry sectors when it comes to emissions. So the agricultural sector also has a very important responsibility when it comes to reducing emissions. And there are, in fact, a lot of potential. This graph, which was published by IPCC, show the potential reduction of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere if you invest in different measures. So the best effect, of course, you have investing in solar and wind power, because you will reduce coal and oil and gas emissions from the atmosphere. But it's also interesting to see that carbon sequestration in agriculture comes out as one of the dominant ways we can, or strategies we can have on the planet to reduce carbon dioxide, that there is this unlocked potential in the agricultural landscape of capturing and storing much more carbon. There's been a lot of discussion about methane coming from agriculture, but if you look at this figure, methane emissions are important, but they are rather insignificant compared to the big capacity that is there of capturing carbon and storing carbon, particularly in the grasslands. And one reason why there is this large potential in agricultural landscapes is that generally we have two different types of soils. We have organic soils, which derives from former wetlands that have been drained and now used for agricultural production. Or we have mineral soils, which is the dominant. So in Europe, only 2% of the soils in agriculture are organic, derived from previously drained wetlands. But they represent a massive emission of carbon dioxide, the absolute majority. While the mineral soils capture and store carbon, the organic soils result in a huge emission. So here is an incredibly low-hanging fruit when it comes to agricultural policy to stop using organic soils for agricultural production, re-wet them, try them to turn from a source to a sink of carbon. And the capacity of wetlands, as you see on this figure, storing carbon is enormous. We have enormous amount of carbon stored in wetlands, and we should keep it that way. We should avoid draining wetlands, and if we have drained wetlands, we should try to restore them and turn them from sources to sink. But I also want to again come back to the grasslands, which I also think are very important in this context. And if they're well managed with grazing animals, we will have to accept some methane emissions. Well managed grasslands also have a large capacity to store carbon in the future. We, from ESAC, published a report 2 years ago on regenerative agriculture, which actually takes a focus on soil, looking at carbon, biodiversity, and productivity. So we looked at this, is this a strategy for European Union, given the Farm to Fork strategy that was adopted and the biodiversity strategy? And actually we came up to the solution going through, I think, 350 reviews and papers on different type of management practices. We came up with a list, quite a long list of practices that actually represent these synergies, that you can maintain agricultural productivity, at least in the long term, while at the same time enhance carbon capture and storage, and restore biodiversity and soil health. And you can see some examples there on these practices, which I think is another low-hanging fruit, that we can include support in our subsidy systems for farming to adopt these practices, because we will have a win-win-win outcome, which I think is very important. And we also made a very big sort of thing around looking at the landscape scale, that we have to move from only looking at the farm scale, also including the landscape scale, because there are lots of important ecological processes occurring on the landscape scale. So, and this means the farmers have to collaborate on the landscape level to achieve these goals. I want to end by saying that it's not enough if we're going to reach this SDG 2 and looking further to feed the world's population, just to focus on the production side. We also need to look at the consumption side, because these are communicating, what's happening in one area will affect greatly the other. This is a system, and I would say, is it possible to have this system to transform in a massive way? I would say yes, but it will depend on that we actually can mobilize not only the research community natural science, social science, and humanities, but also other knowledge holders that have crucial knowledge for this to happen. Not only to come up with innovative solutions, but also understand what are the barriers for implementing the solutions we already have. That's another really important issue. And I think with this, having this, I think this World Science Forum could send a strong message to the world that we need this collaboration, not only among scientific academic disciplines, but also close collaboration with other knowledge holders to solve this. And thank you.
Thanks, Thomas. And that last message of you will certainly be picked up also by our next speaker, Zsolt Molnar, who will speak on knowledge co-production between science and traditional, indigenous and local knowledge in global science policy fora on biodiversity. Zsolt is a professor at the Center for Ecological Research of the Hungarian Academy, and he leads the Traditional Ecological Knowledge Research Group there. He's also very active, besides being a very accomplished scientist, he's also very active as a member of the IPBES, which is an independent intergovernmental body established by states to strengthen the science policy interface for biodiversity and ecosystem services. And I know he's going to pick up on the issue that Thomas already mentioned, that we should use many knowledge systems. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Wim, for the introduction. Let's start with the take-home messages, okay? Before I forget. So the key message is that science is simply not enough in our crisis, multi-crisis. And we have other knowledge systems of humanity we can collaborate with and we can work with. And as a scientist and also as a member of the IPBES society, we know that looking through different eyes is very useful, and it enriches our understanding of the world and enriches our suggestion for policy. But let's start with the opening ceremony, which was full with music, which was co-produced by the traditional knowledge of folk musicians and classical musicians. And Bartók and Kodály, two of the early co-producers of this knowledge, should be mentioned. And also, Peter Gluckman mentioned the transdisciplinarity and the collaboration between the scientific knowledge system and the indigenous and traditional knowledge system, religious knowledge system. He mentioned political knowledge system, yeah, it's developing, and also the practical knowledge system. There are people, land users, who had a deep knowledge and deep connection to the land and sea and waters they manage, but they are very often neglected, not only by policymakers, but also by us scientists. Let's just give you one example, actually taking up what Thomas already mentioned, agriculture. 40% of the land surface is grazed because we cannot produce food on those lands otherwise than through animals. And let's start from the ground, because traditional knowledge is from the ground. This is 2 seconds in a slow motion video when a cattle is feeding. And most of the studies by scientists are doing it on grasslands which have less than 5 species. But most of the natural, semi-natural pastures globally are multi-species. We saw that the cattle ate the grass, but avoids the next plant. And that plant was a legume full with protein. Why a cattle doesn't eat a plant that is full with protein? What we know, that more than 300 people know it, because they are herders and pastoralists, and they know how they manage these species-rich habitats. And there are less than 50, actually less than 8 good publications on this moment. And this moment, how the plant biomass is turned into meat biomass, is crucial, because if we want to utilize our grasslands sustainably, if we want to protect biodiversity on these areas, we have to know We have to know more about this moment. And science was for many, many decades blind of this moment, but millions of people have knowledge about this. IBES, the Intergovernmental Panel for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, is in the front line how to co-produce knowledge between science and traditional knowledge. There are many assessments, and IBES is improving. I joined IBES in 2014, and I remember that year by year the efficiency and the ethics of knowledge co-production was increasing and still increasing. The Convention on Biological Diversity, the Rio Convention, is also very rich in it. There are some pre-IBES efforts by UNESCO and others. IPCC is much behind, and you can ask why. I will tell you later. Just one slide on how IBES argues for the use of other than scientific knowledge systems. The problem is there are challenges because we are scientists, we have a different worldview, and it's really difficult to work with traditional knowledge holders. We have to build not simply capacity, but methodologies, approaches, how to work with those people who are very knowledgeable locally, but often less knowledgeable globally, how to bridge this scale gap. So back to climate change. So science is able to model climate at the global level, but science seems to be behind how to adapt to climate change very locally. And those people who already have a deep understanding of the processes locally can have good ideas. And if you combine the global understanding, regional understanding of science with the local understanding of these people, then you can do something better. We should not forget that 40% of the state protected areas are on indigenous people's land, having indigenous and traditional knowledge, and also 40% of the remaining natural areas are on their land. So if we don't collaborate them, and if we let mining industry, infrastructure, or intensive monoculture to spread on these indigenous lands illegally, very often illegally, or supported by some governments, then we will lose huge amount of biodiversity in these areas. So we need human rights-based approaches. It's very easy to say and very difficult to say because we are more or less living in a colonial mind even in Europe, and even if you don't think so. Why indigenous peoples and local communities are important? Because they have a very diverse contribution to the protection and the maintenance of biodiversity. This is a key figure of the summary for policymakers of the global assessment. I was leading this development of this figure, so I remember the many examples behind all these simple words, how many contributions these people have towards nature or biodiversity. You can ask, okay, are we ready to do this? Inter-knowledge system collaboration. I would say that the methodologies are there. Many of them are already tested. So yes, we can do it. We just have to start it. And finally, only one example about some progress. In the Convention on Biological Diversity, countries have to prepare country reports about the progress in nature conservation. And this is the situation in the fifth report, how much traditional and indigenous knowledge was taken into consideration during the report. And you see there's a change from the fifth to the sixth report. So there are more countries with yellow and red a couple of years ago, and recently it's much better. And even for the seventh report, we hope even more contributions by these other knowledge systems will be to nature conservation. And I started with the take-home messages, so I finish also with the take-home messages. Science is not enough for transformative change. We need all knowledges available for humanity, from global to local. And the added value of looking through different eyes is a good experience, more
by most of us who are already working with these people. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sol. Initially, we had hoped to have a longer time for the discussion, but unfortunately, there will not be time to have the audience ask questions. I would like to take the last 10 minutes with the panel, and we've been informed, we were happy that Jason Jabour, we learned that he would be here at the World Science Forum. He is with the United Nations Environmental Program stationed in Nairobi, Kenya, and he was willing to join us here as a panel. And I think since you have not been a speaker, I would like to give you the floor first to make a few comments given on what you've heard. And then what I propose to do is that I will give each of the other panel members a chance to, in 1 or 2 minutes, give a take-home message from the talk or from what you've heard from the other talks. Jason.
Thanks very much. Is this on? I think you can hear me. Great, super. So, wow, that was extremely insightful, and as the speakers were sharing these insights, I was thinking to myself, as we often do at the UN Environment Program, about this thing we call the science policy interface, which in and of itself as a concept is changing. And I think a very positive sort of outcome for me, reflecting on this space where these two seemingly disparate communities come together, but I think we're seeing that's not exactly how it plays out. A few things have resonated with me that I just want to draw your attention to. I basically would distill my points into 3 kind of areas. One, and these are relevant to the SDGs. These are relevant to not just the pursuit of shared goals and whether they're the SDGs or what comes after the SDGs. These are observations that I think are pertinent to how and why the science policy interface is changing. And the first one is this issue of reciprocity. I do believe that listening to Elena talk about the S20, that these systems that the scientific community are bringing to the table are proof positive that these communities must find a different way to interface. And I think there are some real promise and tools in how we are moving towards the process of, as you've just noted, co-production, but I think even more than co-production, it's co-discovery. We need to understand what the others see and don't see and why. And I think that this issue of reciprocity comes down to a difficult but important notion also for building trust in science. In the multilateral space, it's no different. The cracks in the walls in terms of where the multilateral system seems to be failing or not delivering also come down to issues of trust. And it's really understanding how the different communities have to come together and what we're willing to do for each other and reciprocate in order to build back these issues of trust. So that was the first thing. The next thing is this concept of agility. I think we get hung up, and I'm going to be a bit unorthodox here in my reflection here, but just indulge me for a second, but we get hung up in these edifices, both within the scientific community and the multilateral space. We've heard all week that the scientific endeavor and the scientific enterprise is a practice, it's a method, it's not a destination. We do need structure and ways to organize the incremental progress and communicate the incremental progress that science is making. And yes, there are breakthroughs and crescendos, as we heard last night, and everywhere. But I think if we get too fixated on the crescendos and the edifice, whether they be the SDGs, the goals, the targets, the indicators, at the expense of understanding that these are time-bound and quite artificial structures, I think we lose sight and we start to lose hope And I think that there's a message there that as important as the milestones and the goals and the long-term endeavors and ambitions are, both within the scientific enterprise and multilateralism, we need to have the agility to course correct, the humility to say, I think some of these indicators are actually wrong given the changing context, and the ability to move as a community towards possibly a different shift. So that was the second thing. And the last thing I think I've heard from all the speakers is the value and the importance of anticipation. And I think what's close to this for me is, and we've heard this a couple times this week, but the strength of uncertainty, or rather treating uncertainty as a strength, not a weakness. And I think that in part that is manifest in how the scientific community can come together and support those who are lean on the scientific community in anticipating in the face of uncertainty. And I think that's very, very true for the SDGs. They were created at a time, which seems not too long ago, but where the global context has shifted so tremendously from the point at which those were negotiated and enshrined. And we just need to be agile and enough to see where we need to course correct. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Jason, for these are wonderful remarks and food for thought. And I wish we had another half an hour to discuss these with the panel. But given the time, I'm just going to follow the original sequence and allow all the speakers to give in 1 minute a concluding remark or maybe reflect on what Jason just has said. Helena, may I invite you? Yeah, you first.
Okay. Okay, so I would say do not forget social justice. If we keep that in mind, I think we'll be able to move forward, because social justice includes education, equity, fair treatment for all, health, everything. So that's my final quote. In 1 minute, less than 1 minute.
I'm sure you would have several other things to mention, but thanks a lot. Rosa.
Okay, so I think climate change is a major threat to health, if not the major threat to health right now. And reflecting on what we heard just from Jason on anticipation, that's really, I mean, we are not even at the level of anticipation now. We really have to address it, but also anticipate what's coming next. Just on the bright side, if there is any bright side, one of the things that the report of Isaac also said is that there is big co-benefits for health that will come up if the policies on mitigation and adaptation are implemented in the right way. And I think the right way is what we heard, is involving also the communities, the other forms of knowledge. And this is really important going forward. So these co-benefits can be because we create more green spaces, we improve the quality of the air, and we will improve also mental health of people if the policies on adaptation and mitigation are built upon strong science, but also upon this discussion with the communities that are affected. So.
Thank you, Rose. Thomas.
Thank you. I think these days we are really looking for what are the good signs, something we could feel good about. I just want to mention one thing, being at the COP16 in Cali in Colombia a couple of weeks ago, that even though the outcome of the meeting was sort of mixed, there was one important step forward, and that was that indigenous and local communities finally got a formal platform to speak up and have their voices heard. And I think it's incredibly important because it will help us enriching the picture and also reach out to different communities and sort of really have a strategy for implementing solutions.
Thank you. Salt?
I just realized that we have a very nice picture, a figure on the screen, which is a multiple evidence-based approach.
So when we speak about communication, that's a two-way process. It's not simply science to policy or science to people, but it has to be a two-way process. And this paper actually emphasizes that scientists not simply need to involve stakeholders during the research, but they have to co-design the research. Then doing the data collection and analysis together and publish together, and that's real involvement, that's real communication, that's collaboration. It's not a one-way process, but a two-way process.
It's the reciprocity that Jason also mentioned. Jason, would you like to have a final?
Oh wow, that's a lot of power. Look, I think this idea that there is no one silver bullet and is really important. I think that we need to broaden not just the ways that we produce and synthesize information. We need to look and be very creative within and beyond the scientific community of how we actually deliver that information. To me, so much of this actually comes down to communication, and I think that this fora and forums like these that clearly embed and cross boundaries in terms of communities and who's engaged are really proof that we're going to need to broaden the conversation, bring in as many people, and put the conversation in some cases really just around the dinner table, and not just at the highest levels of decision making, but also to our children and to the schools, and so that's all of that I think is a big role to play for science communication.
And a daunting task for all of us, because basically, as was said this morning in the plenary session, climate change really affects essentially all the sustainable development goals, and it touches on everything here. And that's again what the session also showed. Apologies for the fact that, well, we had to start a bit late and we had little time for discussion, and unfortunately I couldn't allow the people in the audience to ask questions, but please join me in thanking all the speakers for their contributions, and feel free to come up afterwards. I'm sure that they're willing to talk to you more if you would like to ask them questions or give them your comments. Thanks a lot to all the speakers.